hard pruning. So she began making landscape paintings, and I, with somewhat less striking results, began making landscapes. It wasn't very long before I discovered I was ill-prepared for the work I'd taken on. The local New England landscape, a patchwork of abandoned farms swiftly being overtaken by second-growth forest, proved far less amenable to my plans for it than the tame suburban plots of my childhood had. Here were large and rapacious animals, hegemonies of weeds, a few billion examples of every insect in the field guide, killing frosts in June and September, and boulders of inconceivable weight and number. But there were obstacles of a very different kind that proved just as vexing. The unexamined attitudes toward nature I'd brought with me to the garden. Like most Americans out of doors, I was a child of Thoreau. But the ways of seeing nature I'd inherited from him, and the whole tradition of nature writing he inspired, seemed not to fit my experiences. In confronting the local woodchucks, or deciding whether I was obliged to mow my lawn, or how liberal I could afford to be with respect to the weeds, I was deep in nature, surely, but my feelings about it, though strong, were something other than romantic or worshipful. When one summer I came across Emerson's argument that weeds, just then strangling my annuals, were nothing more than a defect of my perception, I felt a certain cognitive dissonance. Everybody wrote about how to be in nature, what sort of perceptions to have, but nobody about how to act there. Yet the gardener, unlike the naturalist, has to, indeed wants to, act. Now, it is true that there are countless volumes of practical advice available to the perplexed gardener, but I felt the need for some philosophical guidance as well. Before I firebomb a woodchuck burrow, I like to have a bit of theory under my belt. Yet, for the most part, Americans who write about nature don't write about the garden, about man-made landscapes and the processes of their making. This is an odd omission, for although gardening may not at first seem to hold the drama or grandeur of, say, climbing mountains, it is gardening that gives most of us our most direct and intimate experience of nature, of its satisfactions, fragility, and power. Yet traditionally, when we have wanted to think about our relationship to nature, we have gone to the wilderness, to places untouched by man. Thoreau, in fact, was the last important American writer on nature to have anything to say about gardening. He planted a bean field at Walden and devoted a chapter to his experiences in it. But the bean field, which I talk about in my chapter on weeds, got Thoreau into all sorts of trouble. His romance of wild nature left him feeling guilty about discriminating against weeds. He rails against the need for such invidious distinctions. And he couldn't see why he was any more entitled to the harvest of his garden than the resident woodchucks and birds. Badly tangled up in contradictions between his needs and nature's prerogatives, Thoreau had to forsake the bean field, eventually declaring that he would prefer the most dismal swamp to any garden. With that declaration, the garden was essentially banished from American writing on nature. I think this is unfortunate, and not just because I happen to stand in need of sound advice in the garden. Americans have a deeply ingrained habit of seeing nature and culture as irreconcilably opposed. We automatically assume that whenever one gains, the other must lose. Forced to choose, we usually opt for nature, at least in our books. This choice, which I believe is a false one, is what led Thoreau and his descendants out of the garden. To be sure, there is much to be learned in the wilderness. Our unsurpassed tradition of nature writing is sufficient proof of that. But my experience in the garden leads me to believe that there are many important things about our relationship to nature that cannot be learned in the wild. For one thing, we need, and now more than ever, to learn how to use nature without damaging it. That probably can't be done as long as we continue to think of nature and culture simply as antagonists. So how do we begin to find some middle ground between the two, to provide for our needs and desires without diminishing nature? The premise of this book is that the place to look for some of the answers to these questions may not be in the woods, but in the garden. Though this book is not a polemic, it is full of argument, between me and this vexing piece of land, and also between me and some of the traditional ways of looking at nature in America. I find I spend a lot of time arguing with Thoreau.